January 16th, 1809. The port of Corunna, northwest Spain. 15,000 British soldiers stood with their backs to the sea, exhausted from a 250-mile winter retreat through the mountains. Behind them, Royal Navy ships waited to evacuate them to safety. In front of them, 20,000 French soldiers under Marshal Soult prepared to attack, intent on destroying the British army before it could escape. Lieutenant General Sir John Moore, commanding the British force, knew he had one job: hold the French long enough for his army to board those ships. His men were starving, frost-bitten, and demoralized after the nightmare retreat from Sahagun. But they were still British soldiers, and Moore intended to show the French that even in retreat, even beaten down by hunger and cold, British infantry could still fight. Moore knew what faced him: fight a battle against superior numbers with exhausted troops, hold long enough for evacuation, and accept whatever consequences came. By sunset, everything would be decided. Either his army would escape to fight another day, or it would be destroyed on a Spanish beach, trapped between French bayonets and the sea. This is the story of Corunna, Britain's heroic defeat, the battle that looked like disaster but preserved an army, and the death of a general who became more famous in dying than in all his victories combined. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into one of the Peninsula War's most dramatic moments, a rearguard action where everything depended on discipline under pressure, where a general's sacrifice saved his army, and where British infantry proved yet again that even in the worst circumstances, they could stand and fight. But before we get to that desperate defensive line outside Corunna, before we watch French columns crash against British squares while Moore bleeds to death on the hillside, we need to understand how the British army ended up trapped on the Spanish coast in winter. Because without knowing the retreat from Sahagun, one of the most brutal withdrawals in British military history, you can't appreciate what Moore achieved at Corunna. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We cover the battles that shaped Britain, the victories that built an empire, and the defeats that tested its character. Don't miss them. Let's go back to October 1808, when Sir John Moore led 30,000 British soldiers into Spain with orders to support Spanish forces fighting Napoleon's occupation. It was the early days of the Peninsula War, the conflict that would drag on for 6 years and drain France of hundreds of thousands of men. But in late 1808, Napoleon himself was in Spain with 200,000 veterans, crushing Spanish resistance with methodical brutality. Moore's mission was to link up with Spanish armies and create a unified front against the French. But Spanish resistance collapsed faster than anyone expected. By December, Napoleon had scattered every Spanish army that faced him. Madrid fell, Spanish generals fled or surrendered, and Moore found himself deep in hostile territory with a French army 3 times his size, manoeuvring to cut him off. Moore faced an impossible choice: advance deeper into Spain and be surrounded, or retreat toward the coast and try to evacuate. Advance meant glorious battle and probable annihilation. Retreat meant saving his army, but looking like a coward. Moore chose retreat. It was the harder decision, the one that would be criticised and second-guessed, but it was the right decision. On December 23rd, Moore began withdrawing toward Corunna, the only Spanish port where the Royal Navy could evacuate his army. The retreat started in good order, professional soldiers conducting a textbook withdrawal. Then the weather turned. Winter storms hit the mountains. Snow and freezing rain made roads impassable. Supplies ran out. And discipline began to crack. The retreat from Sahagun to Corunna became a nightmare. Soldiers dropped from exhaustion, frostbite, and starvation. Some froze to death in mountain passes, their bodies left where they fell. Others deserted, seeking shelter in Spanish villages. Horses died by the hundreds, collapsing from exhaustion, shot when they could no longer walk. Equipment was abandoned along the road, muskets thrown away to lighten loads, ammunition dumped, supply wagons pushed off cliffs. Discipline collapsed in some units. Soldiers got drunk on looted wine, broke into Spanish homes, abandoned their equipment. Officers lost control. Men who'd served together for years turned on each other over scraps of food. It was the British army at its lowest point, reduced to a starving mob fleeing through hostile country in winter. But the rear guard, the units that covered the retreat, fighting French cavalry patrols and screening the main army, maintained discipline. These were the professional infantry regiments, led by officers who refused to accept defeat. They marched in formation, fought when necessary, and protected the collapsing main column. Without them, the entire army would have been destroyed in the mountains. Marshal Soult commanded the French pursuit. He was one of Napoleon's best generals, methodical, aggressive, and determined to destroy Moore's army before it could escape. Soult's cavalry harassed the British rearguard constantly, trying to delay them, force them to stand and fight in unfavourable terrain. But Moore kept withdrawing, accepting losses, refusing to be drawn into battle until he reached Corunna, where the navy waited. The British army staggered into Corunna on January 11th, 1809. They'd marched 250 miles in 3 weeks through winter storms and French attacks. They'd lost thousands of men to cold, hunger, and desertion. They looked nothing like the professional force that had entered Spain in October. They looked like refugees. But the Royal Navy had failed to arrive. The transport ships that were supposed to be waiting at Corunna were delayed by storms. Moore's exhausted army had reached the evacuation port, but there were no ships to evacuate them, and Soult's French army was right behind them, preparing to attack. Moore faced another impossible choice. His army couldn't march anymore. The men were physically and mentally broken. They couldn't defend Corunna forever. Soult had more troops and better supplies. But if Moore tried to retreat further along the coast, his army would disintegrate completely. So Moore made a decision. They would stand at Corunna and hold long enough for the ships to arrive. Even if it meant fighting a battle, they couldn't win. Moore was 57 years old, a professional soldier who'd served Britain for 35 years. He'd fought in the American Revolution, the West Indies, Ireland, Egypt, and Sicily. He trained the light infantry tactics that would serve Britain so well in the Peninsula War. He was experienced, competent, and utterly committed to his men's welfare. Now he would stake everything on one final defensive battle to save the army entrusted to his command. Moore spent the next 4 days reorganising his shattered force. He had about 15,000 effective soldiers, the men who'd survived the retreat with their equipment and willingness to fight intact. He deployed them on high ground south of Corunna, anchoring his right flank on the village of Elvina and his left on the coast. It was a strong defensive position, but it required his exhausted troops to dig in, prepare defences, and be ready to fight men who hadn't just marched 250 miles through mountains in winter. British soldiers, seeing Royal Navy ships finally arrive on January 14th, felt relief mixed with dread. The ships were here, but they were in the harbour, not at the docks. Loading 15,000 men and all the equipment would take days. And Soult wasn't going to wait patiently while they boarded boats. Moore prioritised the evacuation carefully. The sick, wounded and cavalry went first. They couldn't fight and would just consume resources. Artillery was spiked, rendered useless, and abandoned. They couldn't take the guns and wouldn't give them to the French intact. Supplies were loaded, and the infantry dug in to defend while everyone else evacuated. January 16th, 1809. Marshal Soult had 20,000 French soldiers ready to attack. He'd been chasing Moore's army for weeks, watching British discipline collapse, seeing men desert and equipment abandoned. He expected the final battle to be a formality. Exhausted, demoralised British infantry breaking under French pressure, allowing him to capture or destroy the entire force before it could evacuate. Soult was catastrophically wrong. Around 2 p.m, French artillery opened fire on British positions. Moore's artillery, what little he'd kept, responded. Then French infantry columns advanced toward the British right, targeting the village of Elvina, where General Baird's division held the line. This was classic French tactical doctrine. Mass columns advancing rapidly under artillery support, relying on momentum and numbers to overwhelm defenders. But British infantry had faced French columns before. At Vimeiro, at Roliça in Egypt in the West Indies, they knew how to fight this way. The British army had spent years perfecting its infantry tactics, two-rank line formation to maximize firepower, disciplined volley fire, rapid reloading drills practiced until soldiers could load and fire without thinking. As French columns advanced, British infantry formed line, 2 ranks deep, maximizing firepower. When the French got within effective musket range, about 100 yards, British officers gave the order, fire. The British volley was devastating. 2-rank line formation meant maximum firepower concentrated on narrow French column fronts. Dozens of Frenchmen fell with each volley. French troops tried to deploy from column into line to return fire effectively, but British reload drills were faster. A well-trained British infantryman could fire 4 aimed shots per minute. That's 1 shot every 15 seconds. Load, aim, fire, load again. French soldiers, many conscripts, couldn't match that rate. The French attack on Elvina stalled under British firepower. Officers tried to rally their men for another assault, waving swords, pushing forward through the smoke, but British discipline held. Soldiers who'd barely survived the retreat stood in perfect lines and fired volley after volley. The village changed hands multiple times in vicious close-quarters fighting, musket fire at arm's length, bayonets thrust into bodies, rifle butts smashing skulls. Men stabbed each other in doorways and alleys, fought over every house. Bodies piled in the narrow streets, but British infantry wouldn't break. General Moore rode along the British line, visible to his men, directing the defence personally. He'd been criticised for the retreat, accused of abandoning Spain without fighting. Now he intended to prove that the British army could still fight, even exhausted and outnumbered. Moore's presence steadied wavering units. Soldiers who might have run stood firm because their general was there, sharing the danger. Around 3 p.m, a French cannonball struck the ground near Moore and bounced up, hitting him in the chest. The impact was catastrophic. His left shoulder and ribs were shattered, his lung punctured. Moore fell from his horse, clearly dying. Blood soaked through his uniform. Officers rushed to him, horror on their faces. But Moore, even knowing he was dying, wouldn't show weakness. His first concern wasn't his injury. It was the battle. "Are the French beaten?" Moore asked through bloody lips. His officers assured him the line was holding. Moore, satisfied, allowed himself to be carried from the field. As soldiers bore him toward the rear, he kept asking about the battle's progress, about whether his men were still holding. Even dying, Moore's focus was on his army's survival. The battle continued through the afternoon. French attacks against the British centre and left were repulsed with heavy French casualties. Soult threw more troops forward, trying to break through before darkness made coordinated attacks impossible. But British infantry held every position. Exhausted men who'd barely survived the retreat fought with desperate courage because they knew ships waited in the harbour. This wasn't a battle for glory, it was a battle for survival. By sunset, around 6 p.m, French attacks had stopped. Soult had suffered approximately 1,500 casualties, killed and wounded, trying to break the British line. British casualties were similar, around 800 killed and wounded, but the crucial fact was this: the British line hadn't broken. Moore's army had held long enough. That evening, British soldiers withdrew to Corunna's harbour under cover of darkness. French forces, bloodied and exhausted by the day's fighting, didn't pursue. Through the night of January 16th, 17th, 15,000 British soldiers boarded transport ships in remarkably good order. The evacuation that had seemed impossible happened efficiently, professional soldiers and sailors executing a complex operation under pressure. Sir John Moore died around 8 p.m. on January 16th, hours after being wounded. His last words, according to witnesses, concerned his army. "I hope the people of England will be satisfied. I hope my country will do me justice." He was buried that night at Corunna, in a hasty grave dug by his officers. The funeral was brief. There was no time for elaborate ceremony with an army evacuating under French guns. Moore's death transformed him from controversial general to national hero. The man who'd been criticised for retreating without fighting became the general who gave his life saving his men. Charles Wolfe's poem, The Burial of Sir John Moore after Corunna, became one of the most famous works in English literature. Not a drum was heard, not a funeral note, as his corpse to the rampart we hurried. The poem captured British imagination. Moore became the ideal of selfless military leadership, a general who fought to save his army, not for glory, and died ensuring his men escaped. Whether Moore deserved all the posthumous praise is debatable, but there's no question he accomplished his mission. He saved the British Army in the Peninsula. The Battle of Corunna was technically a tactical victory. The British inflicted heavier casualties than they received and achieved their objective, evacuating the army safely, but strategically, it looked like defeat. Britain had sent 30,000 soldiers to Spain and evacuated 15,000 ragged survivors 3 months later, having abandoned Madrid, retreated 250 miles, and lost thousands to cold and desertion. Yet Corunna mattered enormously. It preserved the British army that would return to Portugal under Wellington and eventually drive the French from the Peninsula. If Moore's army had been destroyed at Corunna, Britain might not have had the troops to continue the Peninsula War. Moore's sacrifice and his soldiers' resilience kept Britain in the fight. The retreat from Sahagun and the battle at Corunna taught important lessons. First, logistics matter as much as tactics. Moore's army disintegrated, not because of French attacks, but because of supply failures and brutal weather. Second, discipline under pressure defines professional armies. The units that maintained cohesion during the retreat were the ones that fought effectively at Corunna. Third, leadership affects everything. Moore's visible presence at Corunna steadied his men despite overwhelming odds. Moore's reputation transformed after his death. In life he'd been a controversial figure, a professional soldier who'd served with distinction in many campaigns but lacked Wellington's political savvy or Nelson's flair for drama. In death he became a martyr, proof that British generals cared about their men enough to die for them. Charles Wolfe's poem ensured Moore would be remembered not for his victories, but for his sacrifice. The soldiers who fought at Corunna and survived the evacuation would form the core of Wellington's Peninsula Army. These were men who'd been tested by the worst conditions: winter retreat through hostile territory, near starvation, constant French pressure, and survived. They'd seen British discipline at its worst during the retreat and at its best during the battle. They knew what professional soldiering meant. Wellington, who would later command these same men to victory after victory in Spain, acknowledged Moore's achievement. Despite tactical disagreements with Moore's decisions, Wellington recognised that without Corunna's successful evacuation, there would have been no British army to return to Portugal in 1809. Moore saved the army that Wellington would lead to glory. From a French perspective, Corunna was frustrating. Soult had chased Moore's army across Spain, seen it disintegrate into a fleeing mob, caught it trapped against the sea, and then watched it escape. The battle itself cost French forces heavy casualties without achieving its objective. Soult's official reports to Napoleon were defensive, explaining why he hadn't destroyed the British army, despite overwhelming advantages. Napoleon, characteristically, blamed Soult for the British escape. The Emperor had left Spain by early January, confident his marshals could finish off Moore's army. When he learned the British had evacuated successfully, he was furious. For Napoleon, who measured success in enemy armies destroyed, letting 15,000 British soldiers escape was unacceptable failure. The strategic impact of Corunna extended beyond 1809. It demonstrated that British armies could operate in the Peninsula despite French numerical superiority. It proved that Royal Navy control of the seas gave Britain strategic flexibility. Armies could land, operate, and evacuate without being permanently trapped. And it established that British infantry, even exhausted and outnumbered, could fight French veterans on equal terms. Moore's tactical decisions at Corunna were studied by military theorists for generations. His defensive deployment on high ground, careful positioning of reserves, and gradual withdrawal under fire became textbook examples of fighting retreat. The coordination between army and navy for the evacuation showed inter-service cooperation that would be replicated in future operations. Today, Moore is buried at Corunna where he fell. His grave, maintained by the British government, is a pilgrimage site for British military historians and regiments that trace their lineage to units that fought there. Every year on January 16th, ceremonies commemorate the battle and honour Moore's sacrifice. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the battles that looked like defeats but preserved armies, the sacrifices that made victory possible, the moments when courage mattered more than numbers, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other Peninsular War battles should we cover? Talavera, where Wellington earned his title? Badajoz, the bloodiest siege of the war? Vitoria, the final crushing victory? The battles that built British dominance in Spain? Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.